I'm Iain and welcome back to the Northland Workshop. Before we get started, I just want to say a big thank you to everybody who's subscribed so far. It really means a lot. And now for the topic of today's video. Today we're going to talk about what is typically the first major tool purchase you'll make in your woodworking career, and that is a table saw. Now, whether you get a new table saw or a used table saw, chances are you're going to have to do some tune-up on this thing. It needs some alignment in order for it to cut accurately and to cut safely. So that's what we're going to go over today. How to get the blade to be parallel with the miter gauge slots, and how to get the fence to be parallel to the blade and the miter gauge slot. So that way it all works together. We'll also talk about adjusting the 90-degree and 45-degree stops, so that way the blade tilts and comes back to where it's supposed to be each time. And we will briefly talk about the miter gauge. So this table saw is set up, it's okay. I don't really want to mess with it because it's one of those things where once you get it dialed in, if it checks out, leave it alone. I don't want to knock it out of alignment just for the sake of the video. However, I got a new table saw, and as luck would have it, when it came out of the box, the adjustments are all out of whack on the thing, so we will go ahead and tune this saw. There are several expensive jigs you can buy online that will let you align a table saw, and they use what's known as a dial indicator, which is a little gauge with a needle that will tell you down to the thousandth of an inch the distance. That's way more exact than a table saw needs to be, and those jigs are quite a bit of money. Most woodworkers are already going to have a combination square, and to be honest, that is all you need in order to align your table saw. So the first thing we got to do is align the combination square, set it down in the miter gauge slot, and then push it over, choose one tooth on the blade. I'm using the factory blade because that way if I accidentally chip one of these teeth, it's no big deal because I have a better blade in store for this saw anyways. But what I do is I come over here and I keep pushing the ruler portion of the combination square in until it just barely rubs on that tooth. Now I can go ahead and lock this in place. And now I know I have an accurate distance to the front of the saw blade. It's important to use this same tooth to measure the back, so that way if the blade is warped at all, that'll cancel itself out. So I'm going to rotate this tooth back over, and now I move the combination square back in the miter gauge slot, and if I look, that tooth just barely rubs on it. So that is perfect right there. I don't have to adjust this at all. If I had to adjust the blade to be parallel to the miter gauge slots, I would loosen up these two bolts right here, known as the trunnion bolts. The trunnion is the part of the saw that allows it to tilt for angled cuts, and it's bolted to the bottom of the table. So there's these two bolts here, and there are two bolts in the front for the front trunnion. I would loosen up the bolts and then twist the whole saw assembly one way or the other in order to get it lined up with the miter gauge slots. Now that usually takes several attempts to get it lined up, but once it is lined up, it's good to go. Now depending on the make and model of saw you have, it may be that you move the trunnions. On some of the cabinet saws, you actually loosen up the four bolts that hold the table down to it and twist the table while the blade stays in the same spot. So that's something that is saw dependent, so you will want to check your owner's manual to see what do you have to do in order to align the blade to the miter gauge slot. Now it's time to adjust the fence so that way it is parallel to the miter gauge slot and also the blade. Again, you want to make sure it's parallel so that way it doesn't pinch the wood. Now sometimes you'll hear people say that they like to take the fence and tip it out ever so slightly so that way there's no chance of wood getting pinched behind the blade. I don't like that theory, and the reason I don't like it is for some operations I find myself moving the fence to the other side of the blade. As soon as I move the fence to the other side of the blade, if it's tipped like this, it's now in a situation where it gets narrower at the back and I have a recipe for kickback. Only when the fence is truly parallel to the blade am I safe when it's over here and safe when it's over here. So that's why I like to make sure it's parallel. So the way I'm going to do this is unlock the fence, move it in a little bit, and relock it. You want to make sure the fence is locked when you do this check because it will lock itself square or to whatever angle it's actually set at each time, but when it's unlocked, it's free to twist every which way. So make sure the fence is locked down, and I'm going to do the exact same thing I did for the blade with the combination square and the miter gauge slot. So come back to this end and I lock it in place. Check it one more time. Yep, that's good. Now I come down here, and I don't know if that shows up on camera, but there's about a 1/16 of an inch gap right there. So this fence is tipped that way a 1/16 of an inch. So I need to correct that. Now the way I adjust the fence on this table saw is to loosen up this little threaded post back here, and I can actually unclamp the back side of the fence and push it over so it butts up to this thing, clamp it back down, and then tighten up the Allen screw. Your fence could be totally different than this, and the owner's manual that came with your saw is the best way to find out how to adjust the angle of your fence. Now that I've got it so it touches the ruler back here, I'm going to go up front, check that one again, because that could have moved slightly, and it might take a couple tries, but eventually I'll be able to get it so there's no gap at the front or the back. There are two more checks I need to do to this fence before I call it accurate. First thing I need to do is check that the face of the fence is 90 degrees to the table. And once again, I want to make sure it's locked in place when I do that because the clamp may twist it one way or the other from the unlocked position to the locked position. Easiest way to do that is once again take the combination square and just use it as a square. At this end, there is absolutely no light. That's good. That means this fence is 90 degrees to the table. At this end. I also want to check this end because there might be a twist in this fence. And if I check this end, it looks good too. So there's no twist in this fence. If there had been a twist in this fence and there was no adjustment to take that out, I would either have to shim it with something or get in touch with the manufacturer about a replacement. But don't have to do any of that because this fence checks out with the 90 degrees. The final thing I want to do is get this cursor system that's on this table saw to line up. The way I set it up is I need to have a known distance from the inside edge of this blade to this fence. I'm going to use the most accurate thing I have and the thing I currently have in my hand, which is the metal ruler from the combination square. I'm going to put this up against the fence and I'm going to adjust it so that way it is exactly 2 inches from the edge of the blade. Right there. That is exactly 2 inches. I'm going to lock it in place. Check it one more time to make sure when I locked it, it didn't move. Nope, that is exactly 2 inches. Now, this is really easy. All I have to do is take a look at the cursor and see, does it line up with the 2-inch mark. If it lines up, perfect, don't change a thing. If it doesn't, there's a slot for the screw head on this little plexiglass cursor so I can slide it side to side. In this case, it is just a little bit past 2. So what I'm going to do is take the Allen wrench, once again, loosen it up, and just scoot the cursor over so that way it is centered on the 2. Right there. Now the fence cursor system is accurate to this blade. So that takes care of the fence in this position. However, on this table saw, in order to get the maximum rip capacity, there's another threaded insert in this guide rail, and the way it works is I unclamp the fence and I pick it up and I drop it over this other guide pin back here and then lock it down. And that gives me the setting to get all the way out to 24.5 inches from the blade. Because of this setup, I have to make sure it's parallel to the blade over here. I don't need to go through all the hassle of making sure it's 90 degrees to the table, because if it was 90 degrees over here, it's going to be 90 degrees over here. But depending on how accurate they were at aligning these pins, it might not be parallel. So I will just repeat the process. I want to focus now on the insert plate. And the insert plate is important because you want it level with the table, so that way when you push wood through, it doesn't get caught on the rear edge, which could be dangerous, and if nothing else, annoying. The other thing is that you use part of the insert plate as a reference surface for checking the angle of the blade. So if it's not flat with the table, it's going to throw the angle reading off. The easiest way to check for the plate to be level is, first of all, just listen to it. You can hear it's rocking right there, so at the very least one of the set screws isn't all the way down, and so one side is probably not quite lined up. Easiest way to find that is to take the ruler out of the combination square, put it across the front of it, and here I can see there's no light, it's not rocking, so that's good to go. If I put it back here and I look at it, I see this side is a little low. The nice thing is, it just takes a little bit of adjustment with a set screw to bring it back up where it needs to be. Now it's time to check to see if the blade is 90 degrees to the table when it's up against the 90 degree stop. The way I want to do that is I've first tipped it away from 90 degrees. Now I'm going to rotate it back until it hits the 90 degree stop and lock it in place. Now I'm going to use the combination square again to check it. And according to the combination square, it's actually past 90 degrees this way. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust the 90 degree stop in order to pull the blade back a little bit. So what I'll do is relax the blade again. This takes an Allen wrench, but your saw could be different. So this is one of those look it up in the manual type situations. There, I adjusted it a little bit. We will see how this goes. Once again, put it up against the stop. Better, but still not perfect. So I will repeat that adjustment a couple times. Then I will go through and tip it to 45 degrees so it's up against that stop, and check that as well. Once I got it all set, I went ahead and loosened up the screw for the little pointer and adjusted the pointer so it also reads 0 degrees. So that way it tracks the rest of the way through the scale. Now we have to adjust the miter gauge. Now this is the little miter gauge that came with the saw. It's tiny, it's sloppy, and it's plastic. The way to adjust this miter gauge is to take the miter gauge and then put it somewhere and forget where you put it and never speak of that miter gauge ever again. It is a joke. Then go dig up a real miter gauge. Ta-da! Real miter gauge, real metal. So, the nice thing about this table saw is that it uses standard size miter gauge slots. So that way you can use standard miter gauges in place of its woefully inadequate gauge. So how do we set up this thing? Well, it's got 3 set screws for 90, 45 in one direction, and 45 in the other direction, and this little flip stop. Your miter gauge that you find to replace the pathetic miter gauge on your saw could be totally different. So I'm just going to go over a couple quick things. One of the quickest ways to set a miter gauge to 90 degrees is to take it off the saw, loosen it up, flip it upside down, and then stick it back on the saw and push it up against the front of the saw. And then lock it down while holding it up against the front of the saw. The nice thing is the miter gauge slot is 90 degrees to the table. And if we check it, we're going to find that that is in fact set to 90 degrees, just like that. That's the easiest way to repeatedly set it to 90 degrees. If your table saw doesn't have its miter gauge slots 90 degrees to the front edge or the frame rail, you've got bigger issues. You probably want to take that saw back to wherever it came from because there's something horribly wrong with it at that point. So, that's the easiest way to set it to 90 degrees. Everything else, you can simply use a square to the blade to set the angles, or use the little protractor on the thing. So that basically explains how to take a table saw out of the box, or one that's used that is in need of a tune-up, and tune it up. One thing to keep in mind is that over time a table saw may require another tune-up. It's good to always check before a project that things are actually how they're supposed to be. The blade is actually square, the fence is parallel to it, all that good stuff. Now, unless this thing gets dropped off the back of a truck or something like that, the blade should stay parallel to that miter gauge slot. That shouldn't change. The fence could get out of whack eventually, and the miter gauge very likely will get out of whack from changing angles. So those are the two things I check most often, is that it's at 90 degrees, the fence is parallel, the miter gauge is actually at the angle I want. So I hope you found this video helpful on how to set up a table saw.